standing on the promises of Christ my King, through eternal ages and praises ring. Glory in the highest I will shout and sing, standing on the promises of God. Stand we, standing on the promises of God, my Savior. Stand we, I'm standing on the promises of God.
We're looking at Matthew chapter 12, and what I thought I'd do this morning is recap. I know some of you, including myself, were not here, and I suspect my notes are quite different than James' notes anyway. We won't dwell on it for fear of too much repetition. But in this particular section, as we noted a couple of weeks ago, the persecution of Jesus had really escalated. And the focal point of that persecution during his ministry seemed to have had to do with the abuse or the neglect of observing the Sabbath, as the religious leaders thought should have been done. And this particular story, verses 1 through 8 of Matthew 12, it's also found in Mark chapter 2, beginning with verse 23, and also Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, had to do with the disciples picking grain on the Sabbath day. And Jesus, of course, dealing here with the Sabbath or proper observance of the Sabbath day, and also having to deal with the traditions of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes, which had strayed away from actually the Sabbath laws or the proper observance of the Sabbath law. And one of the things that really comes out, I think, of this particular section is that the religious leaders of that day had become more concerned about their particular traditions, that they had gotten to the point that they were really neglecting their care and their concern for people, possessions. In the one story in reference to a sheep, being rescued, and that being more important to them than the healing of a man. So the keeping of the traditions in reference to the Sabbath had gotten to the point to where they had really lost the real point of reaching out to those that were lost and those that needed to be brought back into the fold. They had forgotten that God's love was for people, not for things. And of Jesus, as he now is on the scene, he is going to, of course, give his life, and he's going to die for people, not for stuff. And I think that that's brought out here in this particular section. I wanted to look at verse 8 of chapter 12, where he says, "For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Important to note that Jesus wasn't indicating that he could change the law in reference to the Sabbath, or that he could ignore the Sabbath law. But rather the fact that the Sabbath, he was the interpreter of the Sabbath law. He was the originator. He was the creator of all days. Going back to John chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, that talks about the fact that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word in reference to Jesus Christ. So he was the creator of all things. He was obligated to live under the old covenant, and yet at the same time he knew exactly what one was to do in order to observe the Sabbath or to keep the Sabbath. And I thought it was important here as he talked about what David had done in reference to the Sabbath, and particularly in reference to verse 5. He says, "Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless?" Noting their argument was that you couldn't work or do anything on the Sabbath, and he notes that the priests work, and they of course did not profane the Sabbath. They were offering sacrifices and doing the things that needed to be done. Point being, I think, that they had gotten to the point to where they were condemning anything and everybody, and had really lost their love for people and the understanding that the observance of the Sabbath under the law of Moses was to be a blessing for the people, something that would cause them to take this particular day to honor God and to serve God. And I think that that's a challenge for us as well. We don't have a holy day today as they did. We are to assemble on the first day of the week to study, to worship, to pray, and to sing together. But we need to keep in mind that in the coming together and the worship that we do, it is to show honor and glory and respect unto God, and not allow things to become so technical that we forget, that we're here to love God and to love one another, and not allow our opinions of way things ought to be done, or things that God has given us to do, that he has left to our judgment as far as the timing of the service and the order of the service and those types of things, to become so caught up in those things, and things maybe not being done the way that we think they ought to be done, or not the way that I would like for them to be done. And I'm not talking about deviating from what the Bible says, but in those areas of opinion, that we forget about our love for God and our love for one another. And that seems to be one of the problems here. And of course, these folks were looking for something that they could condemn Jesus with anyway. Anybody with any other thought or comment there from last week, or if you were not here, something that you wanted to ask about or comment on? Okay, the next section, verses 9 through 14, this is the healing of the man's hand, and this is the section where Jesus in verse 11 talks about what they would have done if a sheep had fallen into the pit on the Sabbath, and obviously they would have rescued their sheep or their ox or their ass or whatever type of animal they might have been using. They would have, of course, rescued that. And Jesus uses that illustration, I think, to try to get them to realize and understand that there was so much hypocrisy here in what that they were accusing him of, and they had just lost the whole point. And again, I think that we need to be aware of that danger for ourselves, to concentrate and to remind ourselves of why we're here, and why we come together to study, why we come together to pray and to sing, and to not lose that focus. It's easy to do that. It's easy, I think, to allow things to become somewhat more of a routine. And that's exactly what had happened to these people, and it can also happen to us as well. I also notice in verse 14, I'm still in Matthew 12, then the Pharisees went out and plotted against him how they might destroy him. And also, we find that they were getting together, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, some of these groups that normally were enemies one with another. Now they were joining together to try to condemn Jesus. He was taking the crowds that normally had followed them, and he was taking away the influence that they had. And so some of these groups that normally were at odds one with another, were now working together. And I think that we can see that somewhat in the religious world today. Many times religious groups that are quite at odds with one another will actually unite against the truth, will actually come together in opposition to what God actually says and what God actually teaches, and how that he instructs us to live and to conduct ourselves. And I guess if we look down through time, it's always been that way, that groups will unite that normally could not be united, but when it comes to standing against the truth, that's exactly what happens. Anybody with a thought there? Okay, that gets us up then to basically where I wanted to look at this morning, beginning in verse 15 that Eric was reading for us there a minute ago. In verse 14 of chapter 12, they were plotting against him, how they might destroy him. And of course, Jesus was aware of their thoughts and what was going on in their minds. So he withdrew from there. And there's several passages in the New Testament that talk about the fact that the time was not yet, or the time was not ready. They tried to destroy Jesus. They would have killed him. They would have stoned him. Whatever they could do on different occasions. But he, being aware of what they were plotting, and also aware of the time schedule, that the time was not yet for him, ready for him to be crucified, he, knowing their thoughts and their minds, would slip away and keep that from happening. So it's interesting, I think, as you look at what Jesus was doing. He was going to give his life. He was going to make that ultimate sacrifice, but he was going to do it on his time schedule, whenever he had accomplished everything that he needed to accomplish with the apostles' training and that type of thing. So he withdrew. Great multitudes followed him, and it says that he healed them all. And we've talked about that a little bit already from other sections in reference to the healing and the miraculous things that were taking place. Jesus did not do as some so-called healers today who are very selective in what they would heal, things that you cannot see, things that maybe cannot be detected one way or the other. It didn't matter whether a person was blind, a person could not hear, a person could not walk, whatever the problem, Jesus could and did upon occasion heal any and all maladies or sicknesses, in contrast to some of the claims that are made today from different individuals. One of the things that we've noted too is that his popularity had grown and continues to grow to the point that he's having a difficult time finding time to rest, finding time to sleep, finding time to eat, and dealing with these multitudes that continue to follow him. Verse 16 says, "And yet he warned them not to make him known." The reason for that was what we're just discussing. It had gotten to the point to where it was, as we would say, 24/7. He couldn't do the things that he needed to do because of the multitudes that were swarming and the multitudes that were following. And This next section, verses 17 through 21 here, is a quote from Isaiah 42, verses 1 through 4. This gives us a little bit of background as to what was going to take place, and how that he is going to sacrifice and give of himself, and particularly also in this section that this death that he's going to give is going to be for both Jew and Gentile as well. Anybody with a thought or comment there on that section, verses 15 through 21 there? All on the same day? I don't know. I would imagine that there's some of these things that are mentioned were done on the same day, but it kind of leaves it open at times, I think, to where it could have been spread out as well. The time frame isn't given as clearly maybe in some of these sections as it is in reference to some of these stories. But whether it happened on the same Sabbath or separate Sabbaths, that would be my guessing. Her question was, did all of this happen on the same day in reference to some of these events? Anybody have a thought there? Okay. Right. Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. If you look at the other passages, if you weren't hearing what James was saying in reference to, it sounds like it was separate Sabbath days, but it sounds as if his days are filled, doesn't it? Not just on the Sabbath day, but every day of the week with the multitudes and the crowds that are coming now. So the abuse of the Sabbath, which he's being accused of doing, I guess would not have come if some of these same things had been done on a different day. But it appears that his week was filled with teaching and preaching, and also these particular miracles that he was performing. These particular ones that he was being accused of being on the Sabbath was why the persecution was directed in that direction. Anybody else there? From what they're supposed to be doing. They had their temple worship, and then later, after everything was destroyed, they had their synagogues, and of course they still got their synagogues at this particular point. But Eric's question has to do with the fact, today we are to assemble together as the church on the first day of the week, and that is left to us to determine, each congregation, the timing of that and that type of thing. For example, last week we met at 2:30 in the afternoon because that was when we could get a place to meet. Was our circumstance last week. Each congregation determines that, and we know that according to the directives of the New Testament, we are to meet upon the first day of the week, and it's left to us to determine how to best do that. Did they do that same type of thing in the synagogue? Did they go to the synagogue at appointed times? Well, we've already noted that there were certain hours of prayer, you remember. The third hour, the sixth hour, the ninth hour. And, Peter and John in Acts chapter 3 were on their way, to the temple at the ninth, at the third hour, I think, of the day, which would have been 9 o'clock in the morning. So there were set times to go. There were sacrifices that were to be offered. But as far as I know, there wasn't a set time, although I suspect that each synagogue had determined maybe a particular time, but I'm not aware of any directive from God that said, okay, this is what you do. Anybody have a thought there? It's a good question in reference to their problems seem to have been in opposition to Jesus, more not what should be done, but just what they thought you couldn't do. And I think that was the issue. They had gotten so concerned about people doing something that they thought they should not do that they had forgotten of what the Sabbath was all about. That they had forgotten, so they were so concerned of looking for a problem and looking for a fault and looking for something that they thought you could not do, that it's just like they'd forgotten about God. They'd forgotten about worship and what worship was all about. Yeah, and I think that comes into the picture here. You've got two groups, and your leaders were following Jesus obviously for the wrong reasons. They were looking for a fault, something that they could charge him with, and the multitude we're going to find also were not necessarily following him for the right reasons either. They were following him for the hopes of a miracle, the hopes of being healed. And as we get later into this and look at the feeding of the 5,000, the 4,000, they eventually turned away from Jesus. They were concerned about what they could eat and that type of thing. And Jesus, as he continues to teach and give his directives, it's obvious that he is not just trying to gain a great audience. What he's trying to do is bring people back to God. And that, I think, should be a warning for us as well. It'd be wonderful to have his house full this morning, wouldn't it? It'd be wonderful, to have folks standing up because we didn't have enough seats. But if that is done, just to entertain, if we're not sticking with the book and not trying to do what God wants us to do, then it defeats the whole purpose, doesn't it? And one of the things that we'll notice as Jesus is teaching here and is directing, he is concerned about people following, but he needs and he wants them to follow for the right reasons. He wasn't healing people just to be doing. He wasn't healing people just to draw an audience, but he was healing people in order to draw their attention to the proper use of the Sabbath, and of course eventually to the proper use of the first day of the week. So much of this gets into the attitudes of the people, and particularly the hypocrisy of the leadership, but that goes even further as you get on down to the common man who was so concerned about what they could get out of it. And I think there's a danger for us there as well. Are we here to learn better and to be reminded of how we can give more and how we can serve more? Or are we so wrapped up in what we are receiving that we miss that point? So I think you're right. There's an issue both ways, isn't there? These folks were following Jesus, and to a great extent, they were not following for the right reasons. The leadership definitely was not, it seems, from the Pharisees and the scribes, but even the common people. When the miracles began to cease, and we noted that they were pretty limited. Here is a statement in reference to the fact that Jesus was healing all, but he didn't continue to do that, and he didn't do that at all times. He allowed that to decrease, and it seems that the reason for that was the fact that became the dominant reason that people were coming in reference to what they could get personally, and not so much from the standpoint of understanding that he was the Son of God, and that this was an opportunity to learn and to become more of a servant rather than something that looking for something that they could receive. Anybody else with a thought there? Ever why? Yeah. Linda said this, it sounds a little bit like the bullying problem that we hear so much about today, and the problems particularly that the Pharisees and Herodians and others were causing, and they were not concerned about what was right, and they were not concerned about what they could gain. Now, I would say that this at this point too, and we've noted this already, it's easy for us to lump all of these folks together, and it's really not right and it's not fair. We know about Nicodemus, we know about others of the Pharisees who did turn to Jesus. They were concerned about what was right, and they did have an understanding of who he was. But as a rule, it seems that these particular groups were more concerned about losing their popularity and losing their influence than they were about the truth and about what they could gain from Jesus as the Christ. It's a good point. Anybody else with a thought there? Well, one of the things too, I think, is that the ministry of Jesus indeed was a ministry of healing and recovery. But even though it involved the physical, and he performed these miracles and, as he did to help the people physically, the bottom line was what was the spiritual recovery that was needed. And I think that that is something that we have to always be conscious of in everything that we do as the church today. Regardless of what particular program we have or what we're trying to do, spiritual recovery, spiritual healing has to be the bottom line. Whether we're talking about, our worship service this morning, why are we here? As we come together like this to study God's Word, the point needs to be, spiritual healing and spiritual recovery so that we can learn and we can grow and we can have a greater understanding of what we ought to be and how God would have us to conduct ourselves. as we spread out and look at our mission work, as we look at visitation, as we look at benevolence, we look at our giveaway day that we do, we look at vacation Bible school, whatever that we do, everything needs to have as a foundation spiritual healing and spiritual recovery. And it's easy, I think, for us maybe to get away from that and to forget, what really the bottom line is. And we see that this was a challenge for the people of this day as well. Obviously, Jesus did perfectly everything that he did. And yet, in spite of the fact that he did things perfectly, the majority seem to have been missing the point. They seem to be more concerned about the physical than they were about the spiritual. More concerned about the appearance. More concerned about their traditions, what they thought was right or wrong, than actually what was right or wrong. And I think a great lesson for us here as well. Anybody with a thought there? Okay, this next section I think is very interesting. My Bible says a house divided cannot stand. This is beginning in verse 22 of Matthew 12. And I want us just to read some of these verses. Then one was brought to him who was demon-possessed, blind and mute, and he healed him so that the blind and the mute man both spoke and saw. And all the multitudes were amazed and said, "Could this be the son of David?" Now when the Pharisees heard it, they said, "This fellow does not cast out demons except by Beelzebub, the ruler of demons." Jesus knew their thoughts, and here's another passage, and we've looked at this idea several times already, thinking about the fact that Jesus knew their thoughts, but he knows our thoughts this morning as well, doesn't he? And that's something that should be very sobering for us, to realize that Jesus knows at all times what we're thinking. Jesus knew their thoughts and said to them, "Every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and every city or house divided against itself will not stand. If Satan cast out Satan, he's divided against himself. How then will his kingdom stand? And if I cast out demons by Beelzebub, by whom do your sons cast them out? Therefore they shall be your judges. But if I cast out demons with the Spirit of God, surely the kingdom of God has come upon you. For how can one enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man, and then he will plunder his house?" And verse 30 is what I wanted, and I think this is the conclusion of what Jesus is talking about here. "He who is not with me is against me, and he who does not gather with me, scatters abroad." Jesus, of course, is being accused of working for Satan, and obviously that was not the case. That's not what he was doing. And he noted that a house divided against itself cannot stand. What Jesus was seeking to do was bring all these people together and to unite, to have a group that would come together to serve God, to move away from their traditions, to move away from what they had begun to think, to move away from the abuse of the Sabbath under the old law, and to stand firmly upon what God was teaching and what God would have them to do. And of course, he was dealing with the same issues and problems that we would deal with today. He was dealing with indifference on the part of the people. Many of these folks were pretty much indifferent in reference to what needed to be done and how it ought to be done. There was irresponsibility as they had become more concerned in his illustration with taking care of an animal than they were with taking care of a person. And there was even rebellion in reference to what was right and what was good. And Jesus is trying to bring both Jew and Gentile together and bring them back to worship and service to God, and to point them back to where their hearts needed to be and where their attitudes needed to be, to make this work in the way that it needed to work. So you see that the struggle that Jesus was having here and what he's accused of, when obviously he was doing what was good and what was right, and here even being accused of being on the side of Satan rather than on the side of God. Anybody with a thought there? Okay. Back up in verse 5 of chapter 12. Bennett's question was, and we'll get back. Eric, was that you that started to say something? Okay, you'll get back in a second. Okay, back up to chapter 12 and verse 5. He says, "Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priest in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Yet I say unto you," and Bennett's question was exactly what was taking place there in reference to what the priests were doing. Anybody have a thought or an idea there? Yeah, I think that's the point, that there had come a time when this had gone, as we say, something went to seed. You couldn't do anything basically, and it went to the point that some even were accusing the priest of doing wrong. But what they were actually doing was doing what God told them to do in service in the temple. So obviously that was not what God intended in reference to work and that type of thing. There were laws and stipulations to cause them to show respect and honor for it, but obviously there were some exceptions. There was some reasonableness, there was some common sense that had come into this thing as well, because the duties of the priest were the same on the Sabbath as they were on any other days as well. Yes? Right. 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 It had to be some common sense, didn't it? So you're right, being clean or unclean, working, there were things that had to be done, and that had to come into it. What had happened is that I think that they had gotten to the point that, to lift a finger almost was a sin, and it wasn't. And that was never God's intention or God's law. So, and it hopefully causes us to realize that some common sense has to be brought into this picture as well. Real quick, Eric, what was the point? Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And if we're not careful, we can get that point too where we got our mind made up that something's wrong or that we don't like something, and then we start looking for something to justify that. Good point. Next week, Luke's move into Mark chapter 3, begin verse 13, and Luke 6:12, where it talks about the naming of the apostles again, and that'll be the next thought. And then we'll go back to Matthew 5 and look at the Sermon on the Mount. Appreciate your comments this morning.